Well, I liked what you said actually, but in the beginning about yours being a sort of a failure to come of age novel, and I was curious, is that something you thought about as you were writing it, or were you setting out to write a coming of age novel or a failure coming of age novel?
Well, let's see. I didn't know until the end. I knew that the challenge for the character and that the challenge on which the book was going to hang is he going to be able to grow up in this way? And I didn't know until near the end if he would or not. And then it turned out, spoiler, he didn't. So, once I knew the character and the parameters of his growth, then it was clear that this wasn't going to be a novel in which he could really successfully do the coming of age. Did you, when you began writing, did you have the coming of age as a framework or a phrase in your head?
I don't know if I consciously sort of thought about it. I think in the beginning, when I was working on that first chapter, I sort of thought about maybe just that one chapter as kind of a coming of age story, just because, his deflowering on the golf course and all that sort of seems, right in the coming of age zone. But in a bigger way, the book, I wanted from the beginning the book to be about these sort of young people who, most of the book sort of centers on the narrator and two friends he makes in college, and sort of their relationship with one another. They have this sort of very unhealthy friendship that is sort of the kind of unhealthy friendship I sort of knew a lot of people had in their 20s, where you're super dependent on these other people and in this really unhealthy kind of way. And so my question in the beginning, and I didn't know the answer either, was are they going to be able to kind of break out of this sort of relationship, or are they going to be able to sort of grow up finally and become dependent people? And I think I was thinking about that because traditionally in a coming of age novel you have like a 16-year-old or 18-year-old or something heading off into the world for the first time, and facing society and becoming crushed by it or something. And I kept thinking to myself that that didn't seem like the way it really happened anymore. I felt like most people weren't getting crushed by society until their late 20s anymore. So that anyway, that was sort of where I started off with that. And I had the same thing. I didn't know until I finished the book. The very last thing I decided was whether or not he was going to actually finally change or not. So.
And I like what you said about coming of age no longer really seems to take place in adolescence, I think. When I read a passage from high school, and that you think of the coming of age novel of the 20th century, and you think of Catcher in the Rye, or there are some recent YA novels that fit right in that are all to do with people sort of getting a little bit more worldly wise as they prepare to graduate from high school. Mm-hmm. And I certainly myself was at my most naive and my least mature as I prepared to graduate from high school. And certainly when I think of the people who matriculated at college with me, none of them seemed to have come of age in any sense other than the physical. And so, now with all this sort of staggering around through our 20s and trying to figure out what it is we're doing and lead a fulfilling life and all the other nonsense that we get to do under late capitalism, it seems as though the whole environment or milieu for the coming of age novel probably is no longer centrally in high school, but is now maybe in some city like Brooklyn or San Francisco, in which the protagonists are trying to figure themselves out.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like I see so many books now that are not billed as young adult novels or coming of age stories in any way, but they're about people in their 20s or even their early 30s who are basically still sort of coming of age. And the whole thing's made me kind of wonder a lot. I've been teaching a class on adolescent literature. We read Catcher in the Rye and Bell Jar and Huck Finn and some other stuff. But yeah, it kind of makes me wonder if there really is such a thing as sort of coming of age at all. I guess the sort of the myth of the coming of age story is that someone sort of leaves home and goes off into the world and sort of figures out their real identity, and they become sort of mature, and then they are an adult, and then they're the same forever after that. I'm not sure. Maybe that happens later, and I'm not there yet personally.
Well,
but
maybe now you
Yeah.
could go directly from your coming of age novel straight into your midlife crisis novel.
Maybe, yeah.
Without even a few years in between.
Or maybe in any sense, like every novel is kind of a coming of some age sort of story.
Sure.
Don Quixote is coming of your 60s or something.
Yeah, sure. When I started thinking about how to describe this book, and it was basically done, and then you have to go around and pitch it to people. It's terrible.
Yeah.
And then I found myself lighting on the phrase coming of age because it seemed to be something that was trying to happen, and then, as I say, failing to happen in this book. And because some of the stuff in the book, as I say, is in high school. And I think it turns out I was confused because there is what you call the novel of adolescence, the high school novel, in which character may or may not come of age. But a coming of age plot it's like a third alternative to the like stranger comes to town, man goes on a journey, right? And man goes on a journey, stranger comes to town, and then like person learns something and grows in some kind of internal way. Which it turns out when you look at it that way, there are a lot of big novels that fit into that, right? Jane Eyre is in that sense a coming of age story, although it's not really a novel of adolescence in the way that we would think of it. And Tristram Shandy is a coming of age story, although a weird, postmodern one in a way that resembles yours in some sense.
I think.
Sure. And so, as a plot, the person learns and grows and changes. It's an internal plot, right? It's a psychological plot. We don't get to voyage out and experience swashbuckling adventure. We get to do some of the things that the novel is uniquely good at, which is to document internal experience.
Yeah.
I feel like that's part of what drew me to that as a story to tell.
Yeah, I like that one. Yeah. And I think it allows us to engage in that question of whether or not we actually do sort of change or grow, or as we grow, is there some sort of end to that, or do maybe as you put it, we just we finally come of age and then we have our rabbit run experience or something.
Yes, great.
That's it. Yeah. Interesting. Can you tell maybe a little bit about sort of how you wrote the book?
Sure. I was enrolled in a graduate MFA program at San Francisco State University, and they wanted me to turn stuff in, and I wanted to be working on a novel because the short story form, it's not something that I really understand how it works in any way. And so I would turn in chapters, and I wanted each chapter to be satisfying to everybody who was reading it, so each one has a sort of little ending or it like wraps itself up. And by the time I was out of the program, I had about 2/3 of the book written, which was helpful because it's nice to have a little audience as you go along. It's nice to have to work something up to the point where you can show it to people without too much shame or embarrassment, because it forces you not to defer all of the difficult choices about how to present this material to the reader.
Yeah.
And then when I was done, I 2/3 of the way through, you basically know where the thing is going and like that. And now you.
Actually similar. I did my MFA sort of right after college, so I was at Columbia for 2 years in my early 20s when I was still coming of age, I guess, and I was working on a book at that point that was actually, I tried to do kind of the same thing. I wanted to sort of come out of there with a novel in tow, and so my first attempt at writing a book was a young adult novel that was very much a traditional coming-of-age story. It was about a young boy who goes to, there's shades of this in here still, but a young boy who goes to a boarding school and he thinks it's sort of an accident that he's managed to get in, and he becomes very close with his roommate Bradley, who's a sort of terrific liar, and it turns out that the main character is also a really good liar, and so they go on and sort of spook the whole school, and the plot revolved around them sort of starting a secret society and running amok. Anyway, I'd written that while I was there, and it all just sort of fell apart basically as the more I tried to work on it, the more awful it got. And the same thing happened basically after that with 2 more attempts. And so this book came about sort of from a reboot early in 2009. I was sort of missing the same that MFA workshop experience, and I couldn't go back to that unfortunately. So what I did was started a little website, and I decided that I was going to. Like you, I never really understood short stories, or as you put it, and how they worked. And I thought maybe that was why I wasn't getting anywhere. I thought maybe I needed to like go back and I tried to like cut that corner and just write a novel straight away. And now realizing that maybe I needed to go back and figure out how to do that. So I started writing short stories and posting them up on this website, and I would just tell all my friends to go check it out each week. And I thought maybe a few writer friends of mine would sort of workshop with me, and it turned out that all my writer friends were way too busy writing their own stuff, and so didn't have time to do that. But my other friends, my bored friends who work in offices and had nothing else to do on their lunch breaks, were thrilled. And so every week on Monday, if I hadn't turned in a new story, they would call, email me and say like, hey, what's up? I'm supposed to read your story today. So anyway, it sort of worked out that way. And my goal had been to write 40 stories over the course of that whole year. I was going to do one every week, and then take a break after 3 weeks, and then come back and do 3 more. And then about 12, 13 weeks into the process, I wrote a story called The Unchangeable Spots of Leopards, and it was just this sort of, as soon as I finished it, I sort of knew that I accidentally had started writing a new novel. I wanted like nothing more than just to sit down and keep writing about those same characters. And so I kind of cheated. I wanted to finish my 40 stories, but I wanted to finish this book, so I sort of cheated, and halfway, sort of throughout the year, every so often I would write a new story that was really a chapter in this book. And to be clever, I would change all the characters' names around so that no one else could tell that they were not the same people from the last story. And that didn't really work. But anyway, and then eventually those stories kind of came together and turned into an actual novel.
So here we are,
Yeah.
2 young and white men,
Yes.
with our debut novels, each a coming-of-age story about a young and, dare I say, white man.
Yes.
Who comes of age, or doesn't.
Yeah.
Not an unusual situation for a writer. Raises the question, to what extent is this book about your own coming of age?
Okay. Well, I should say first off that the narrator never gets a name, and I suppose it's never explicitly clear that he's white, but probably would be white. But anyway, yeah, it's funny. I've always been kind of fascinated by those sort of books where authors create a character who's called Kristopher Jansma, but he's not actually supposed to be them. And I sort of cheated the other way and created a narrator who never gets named. So it sort of felt like, for me, that we left open the possibility as you read it that maybe it really is true. It's really about me. And the book plays on that sort of idea. One of the big sort of topics that the book explores is sort of the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And the narrator himself wants to become a writer, and just like me. And so he tries to write stories about himself and his friends, and with varied success. But the truth is, it's not really like my life at all, and that's one thing that I've actually sort of had. It's been fun, sort of getting out to meet people who've read the book, and then but don't know me. When I was writing the stories originally for my friends, who all know that I'm a relatively like nice and actually like kind of painfully honest person, and then the character in this book is an extremely accomplished liar. He sort of loves to sort of see what he can get away with, as you saw in the part I read, and he's kind of not a good person at all in a lot of the parts of the book. He deceives people, he manipulates people, he sort of surrounds himself with 2 people that are sort of slightly worse people than he is, I guess, but that doesn't really help him much. And that's sort of what the book's about, sort of whether or not he's going to be able to kind of step out of these habits that he's formed. But in real life, I'm nothing like that. I can't lie to save my life. You always know if I'm lying because I'm either staring at the ceiling or the floor while I'm talking to you. And sometimes I do that anyway. But
I will just point out
Yeah.
that's exactly what you would say if you were an extremely proficient liar.
That is true. I say it's a ceiling. Yeah, that is true. It's so for me, writing the character was a lot of fun because he was able to kind of get away with all the things that my heart of hearts I sort of dream about being able to do, but I could never actually do in real life. So yeah, now I get to turn the tables back around on him.
Sure. Well, Eric Muller, protagonist of my novel, has a name, and as I wrote him, I repeatedly, deliberately gave him qualities and aspects to his biography that are very different from my own. He is a Gentile, whereas I'm a Jew. He grows up in terrible sort of wasteland suburbs, whereas I grew up in London, England, in a very literate and cultured household. He has parents who were both pretty incapable of meeting his needs, whereas I have lovely parents. He doesn't go to college, whereas I went to college, and he makes a ton of money as a computer programmer, whereas I made almost no money as nothing. In many ways, he's very different from me. But the reason I made all of those choices is because what I began with was a certain kind of inner experience, a kind of self-consciousness that for different periods in my life has been a kind of primary part of my experience of going through the world, an inability to shut off the voice in your head that's thinking through every interaction and every situation, and difficulty in experiencing interactions or relationships in a natural and unmediated way. And I began this book at the end of a period when that had been most intense, and in order to fictionalize it, I had to get a little bit of distance from it by changing these other aspects.
Yeah, nobody ever writes stories about people with nice families, I've noticed. It's kind of hard to do.
Maybe that'll be the next one.
Yeah, I could try. Yeah, I've had to. This character also has sort of an absent father and sort of a terrible mother, or really not terrible, but just sort of not there either. And yeah, I've had to like make it very clear to my own parents, who are both lovely people, that it's nothing personal. It's just that you're too nice, and so nobody would really care about any story about you guys.
Well, the nice thing, at least in my experience, about making them so different from one's own parents, is that your parents then recognize, well, it's nothing like me. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Anybody? Yes, you there in the back.
I have two.
The very astute looking.
I have two questions. First of all, I'm going to say them both, and then you can each answer them both. Does the label or the category of coming of age, did that ever have a downside to you that bothered you when you heard other people talk about the book or when you've seen it reviewed? And now that you've kind of written one about a young person attempting to gain life experience, do you think you've got that out of your system, or do you think we just go on writing coming of age novels, especially in this age of helicopter parenting?
Those are great questions. May I?
Yeah, please.
So, with regard to the first one, there are so many ways that when you publish a book, people have to talk about the book, and you have to talk about it, and other people have to talk about it, and all of that is just basically intrinsically terrible. And given that, the phrase coming of age is definitely not any worse. And in some ways, maybe it's better. So that particular thing has never stuck out for me as like just a particularly awful. And I certainly have used it myself many times. In response to your second question, I do, as I try to work on other things, I do sort of feel like, well, the last thing I did had this kind of dynamic to it, and so I shouldn't just tell the same story over and again, but in a way that's difficult because I landed on this kind of story because it was compelling to me and I thought I could bring something to it. And honestly, I have a hard time figuring out why I wouldn't just write the exact same book over again. And so maybe I will try to sell that to you and see what happens.
It's still unknown.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I actually think he answered it really well. That whole process and trying to figure out sort of how to sort of sell your book to people, but first before it even gets sold to people, you have to figure out how to convince an agent to read it or a publisher and then to like it, and that was something I had such a hard time with this book in early stages. I had no idea what it was or even really how it had come to get written, as I was explaining. So when I got to the phase where I was sitting across the, from an agent or an editor trying to explain to them what it was, I found myself just sort of stammering and saying like, it's really good, you should read it, and then you'll see. And that doesn't work. So I actually sort of also found myself really liking how easy it was to just be able to say it's sort of, coming of age story. And what I started to say really was it's a coming of age story that sort of then becomes a picaresque novel, which is sort of another, kind of similar actually, type of many coming of age stories are also picaresques, but about halfway through the book things change suddenly, and it becomes more of sort of a travel book. But in that way, it's still, again, sort of the narrator trying to find himself and trying to figure out his real identity and change. So I found that kind of helpful, actually, instead of a burden. And then whether or not I've read another one, I'm in the middle of writing my next book now. It is about characters who are also in their late 20s and living in New York, but sort of different types of characters. And these characters I actually think are a little more come of age already, and so I'm trying to see if there's sort of what happens next. For characters at least who think that they know who they are in their late 20s, sort of then what happens. So, sort of a question I keep asking myself a lot. Sort of I don't feel like I've come of age. I just turned 31. I have a baby. Doesn't really feel any different. My life is different in a lot of practical ways, but I don't actually feel older or more grown up in any way. So, yeah.
In the last 2 or 3 years, these 20-something novels, I've heard the term new adult novel. Did either of you use that term? Did people involved in your projects use that term? Do you think it's a good term to use? Do you think?
I'm not too familiar with the term because I only sort of heard it for the first time after my book came out, but I did. I came across it actually because I was reading someone had written and referred to my book as a new adult book, and my impression of it had been that it was sort of like new adult was sort of something trying to bridge the gap between young adult and actual adult. I'm not sure if that's right, but that was sort of how I took it. And which again, I guess I would be fine with. But back to kind of what I was saying before, I don't know. I kind of wonder, like, at what point can you say that it's an adult book? Like, do the characters need to have a mortgage to pay, or I don't know. Again, I'm not sure what constitutes being a grown-up yet either, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure then in a book, how do you know? I mean, Rabbit Run, which we were talking about before, is a grown man who does something childish and sort of selfish and sort of comes of age, I suppose, all over again. So I don't know if you would term that either. Ultimately, I think all these, young adult, new adult, all these things are coming of age story are ways that we try to kind of figure out how to convince others to read the book. So.
Yeah, people started talking about new adult, and at first I was confused, and so I Googled it a bit, and it seemed like new adult they had made up a phrase that sort of meant, well, you bought the Hunger Games and no other books, but we also have some other books, and they're just normal books and the same books that we would ordinarily be publishing, but maybe you should read those too, they're books. And I didn't quite get the logic of it. Maybe the publishing industry has had terrific success with that model, and if they have, good luck to them.
I feel like it's a little like Manhattan real estate or something, where they take a neighborhood that already exists
yes,
and then they chop it up and say, like, how you live in Novia.
Yes.
Sort of a related question, but you guys mentioned YA a couple times. Is there a clear line of view as to where a book is about young adults and teenagers versus a book that's for young adults and teenagers?
Well, some of the stuff in my book, as you heard, is set in a high school, and I sort of worried as I was writing it that someone was going to say, oh, we like this part, turn it into a young adult novel, because those are very popular. I wanted to write a book that was interesting to me and that addresses problems that seem germane to me, and I hope that I am at a different stage in my life than I was when I was 16. And so I hope that this is a book that would be more satisfying to an older person than to a younger person, not out of any disrespect to teenagers, because I have tremendous compassion and respect for my own teenage experience, but in a way out of respect for the independence and the uniqueness of the adolescent experience. On the other hand, I recently heard from a Canadian teenager who really enjoyed my book, and so great, good, I'm really glad. Cool.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I like I was saying before, I sort of started off maybe thinking, I actually had started when I was writing the book that I was doing in my MFA program. It had never occurred to me that it would be an that it would be a YA novel, and just happened to have sort of two 16-year-old, I think they were a little younger, 14 or 15-year-old characters. But we had been reading books in our class that had characters the same age, and nobody was calling those YA. And then as I was working on the book, that little bug got in my ear that I forget if it was a teacher or a classmate or somebody was like, oh, we should make this into a YA book. Those sell really well. Everybody's reading. At that point it was Harry Potter was sort of just ending, and Gossip Girl was like the new big thing, and John Green was just starting to be a thing, and so I thought, sure, why not? I want to sell a book, so I went along with that, and I think, and it turned out actually, I think that was one of the problems that I had trying to sort of be a quote-unquote YA author, was that I wasn't really, it turned out I didn't really know what YA was. I was thinking about the books that I had liked when I was growing up, and then if I had gone to the store with my mother at age 14 and tried to buy Gossip Girl, I think she would have put me in the basement for a month or something like that. YA somehow changed radically, I think, in between the time when I was a teenager and now, or then. I don't know what it's like exactly now, but yeah, it's so much more. It's so many more things it seems like they can do in those books. I had a relatively sort of wholesome story about two boys at a boarding school that were not doing drugs or having sex or anything, and so one of the responses I actually got was like, "This is too tame. Teenagers won't enjoy this." But yeah, again, that gives me back to the question of, so then where do you draw the line? Because if that's too tame for teenagers, then I don't know, maybe that's a middle school book now, and I don't know where that logic ends.
Would you both say that your relationship with your protagonist sort of ended once you put the final period in your book and stopped it, or have you figured out something else about them afterwards and what that might be?
It is good, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think I had to do, as I was sort of preparing the book for publication, I had to make some sort of changes to it and keep on working on it. But by the time it sort of finished got to its final state, I was pretty much done with it. I was ready to leave the character behind, and I felt ready to sort of let him off into the world, I guess. I do think that in a weird way, as when you're writing it for yourself in the beginning, it's sort of a part of you, and then at some point you start to, it becomes less and less yours as it heads off into the world, and to the point where now, if somebody, reads it and they write on Goodreads or Amazon or something what they think about the novel, I no longer have any ownership over it. I can't, comment back and be like, no, you got that totally wrong. He's not like that, because now it's their book, I guess. So yeah, I've had to kind of let go of it.
It's really interesting. The character, it's really interesting to me. The character began as a particular voice, as a particular way of writing, and all of his attributes sort of came out of that. And I would like, and this guy, his story is done, and we know sort of what happens to him, and I can project forward and imagine what else might happen to him. But I don't need to tell you any more about Eric Muller. That stuff is done. But I would like to keep that voice and that way of writing alive, because it's not like I have an infinite skill set as a writer, and this is part of what I can do, and so I want to use that in some other way. And so in that sense, there are aspects of him that I need to get even further away from, as far away from as I possibly can, in order to make use of the voice that was informing this. So now as I write, when I do feel his presence, I have to kind of push him away out of here, sort of crowding him.
Can I ask you a little follow-up question to that?
Does it have to do with when the next book will be?
No, I don't care, whatever. No, it has to do, so I know there was a period between the first time you thought about trying to publish this novel and then the time it got published. In that interim chunk of time,
Sure.
Was Eric still a presence for you? Did you revise the novel during that time, or had you kind of put it fully aside and then had to bring him back to life somehow?
Yeah, no, at that point, during that dark time, it wasn't just the character or even just the book, it was writing and literature itself that seemed to have spurned me and turned the cold shoulder towards me. And so for a while I had trouble going into bookstores and stuff like that. So I didn't read for a good couple months. It was difficult. So it wasn't as though then I was alienated only from the character. It was from the whole process of writing and the literature. And then when things turned around and when you found the book and when everything, and we did some more work on it and I got back into it and revised the ending of it, and it was as though the whole thing was preserved within me, cryogenically frozen and ready to be awoken at the touch of warmth. So that was cool.
Maybe one last question?
What coming of age novels do you both like and are not your own?
Good. I have one right off the bat. It's called The Saskia, and it's by Brian Hall. Does anyone know this book? She still does. Everybody should write this down. Brian Hall. It's called The Saskia. It came out in the late 90s. It's the story of a teenage girl. She's 13 years old, and she lives on what remains of her parents' commune in upstate New York near Ithaca. And her voice is informed by her reading, which is, she reads mythological stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey and other things like that, but she describes her own sort of ordinary and relatively banal everyday life in these mythological terms because she's engaged in a process of self-romanticizing, which is something that a lot of us go through in adolescence. And over the course of the book, her reality becomes more dramatic and her attempts to frame it in these mythological and romantic terms are sort of strained to the point where they have to snap. And so her coming of age is reflected in the book's voice in this kind of heartbreaking and beautifully handled way. It's one of my favorite books. Everybody should read it. It's called The Saskia, because her name is Saskia, and like Saskia, like that big tail of Saskia. Brian Hall.
Gosh, I don't know. I'm sort of blanking, and I feel like the cliched answer is probably my favorite one. I'm still gonna have to go with The Catcher in the Rye. Which a million reasons not to like that book, and everyone has their favorite, but I still find myself sort of trying to get out. I continue to be amazed, I should say, at like how often that's the example for the thing I'm trying to figure out how to do, or the thing I'm trying to teach. I'm teaching a class right now. It's an advanced seminar in fiction, and we're looking at Ian McEwan and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Lori Moore and all these sort of terrific writers, tomorrow's class, actually, I was preparing this morning. We're talking about flat versus round characters and sort of the genius thing that like Lori Moore can do, where she and I could say actually coming of age novel novella. Her book Who Will Run the Frog Hospital is one of my favorites. I teach that in one of my classes too. She just has that like great ability to, in one sentence, just describe a character. The moment I thought of that, I realized that Catcher in the Rye is my perfect example. Salinger does that like so well. And there's a great essay that I was looking at this morning that actually sort of breaks that down, and how Holden will just sort of one of his sort of many issues is that he just sort of sums people up in one breath, and he just says he's the kind of guy who is always doing X or whatever, and that's exactly what we as writers have to sort of do in order to sell someone in a book on a really vivid character who's only going to be there for a few minutes. So again, I keep coming back to it.
Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you.